teacher. So let's read this together. 2 Peter chapter 2, verses 10 through 16. And it says this. Especially, it's talking about being judged on the day of judgment in verse 9, but now in verse 10 it is saying, and especially those who indulge in the lust of defiling passion and despise authority. Bold and arrogant, they do not tremble as they blaspheme the glorious ones, whereas angels, though greater in might and power, do not pronounce a blasphemous judgment against them before the Lord. But these, like irrational animals, creatures of instinct, born to be caught and destroyed, blaspheming about matters of which they are ignorant, will also be destroyed in their destruction. Suffering wrong as the wage for their wrongdoing, they count it pleasure to revel in the daytime. They are blots and blemishes, reveling in their deceptions, while they feast with you. They have eyes full of adultery, insatiable for sin. They entice unsteady souls. They have hearts trained in greed, accursed children. Forsaking the right way, they have gone astray. They have followed the way of Balaam, the son of Beor, who loved gain from wrongdoing, but was rebuked for his own transgression. A speechless donkey spoke with human voice and restrained the prophet's madness. God used a donkey. Forgive me, but he can also use you and I. Let's pray, shall we? Father, we just come this morning. Again, we're going to be looking at your word, the scriptures that will help us to recognize those false teachers that are out there. So this morning I just pray you'll equip us. You'll equip us to live in this world right now. And we'll be able to recognize that which is false amongst us. Holy Spirit, teach us. Be our guide. Because we ask it in Jesus' name. Amen. And so as Peter continues with this, he's not finished his warnings on false teachers, which is unlike some believers today who seem to readily accept a false teacher. And even if they don't agree with what they teach, they say things like, well, what harm are they doing? We don't need to question them. We have to be tolerant. What's the point in pulling them down? Well, here's the point, guys. The point is they're leading people astray right into hell. That's the point. So there is a point in recognizing and doing something about it. Back then, Peter was disturbed by the inroads these teachers were making, especially into the churches. He was worried about it then. You and I should be worried about it now. It's worse now than it was then. And that's what's happening more and more in these days. He knew that their teachings were subtle, but in actual fact, they were fatal. So again, he continues with more insight on what a false teacher looks like. And while it was Peter's role back then to inform the church then, I believe it's my role now to inform the church now. And that's what I believe leadership is about in any church, is to identify, recognize, and deal with that which is false. Let's face it, we're in a false world. It's hard to find and look and see and recognize anything that's genuine anymore. I haven't got a clue if you're wearing real jewels or not, or real watches or not, or real anything or not. Everything's false. We're conditioned to accept the false. And I believe that includes false doctrine. So unless we recognize what is real, we're not going to recognize what is false. And that's what Peter has been doing up until this point. You and I need to recognize that which is false. We need to have insight on what a false teacher looks like. I don't want to leave you in any doubt as to what describes a false teacher. So that if one shows up at your doorstep, i.e. a Jehovah's Witness, false, a Mormon, false, we need to recognize it and point it out. You know, Julie used to cringe when a JW used to come to my door. She literally. Why? Because I would be there an hour giving my testimony to start with, and then pointing them to the scriptures. Right. Can you imagine if I got to heaven and the Lord said, well, just backtrack to 1985. I can't even remember last week, never mind 1985. Can you remember that time? Those two young men, nice ties, all that, came to your door, and you just kind of, you know, shoot the breeze with them, and, you know, talked about football and whatever. That was your opportunity to tell them about Jesus. The Jesus of the Bible, not the Jesus of Jehovah's Witness doctrine. But guess what? I used to spend time with them. I used to give them a testimony. They used to major on the end times, which was what they used to do. And they were surprised when I kind of knew a little bit about it. And we talked and we discussed. But they eventually got the picture. We moved here to Sarasota, and in the other house, the first house we're in, two ladies used to come to the door. Eventually they told me that they need now to get the elders of the church to come and talk to me, because they weren't qualified to be able to have a conversation with me. And eventually they stopped coming. They stopped coming because I didn't compromise the gospel of Jesus Christ. They stopped coming because they knew as soon as they come to my door, they were going to get the real thing and not just a fake conversation. And that's what you and I need to do. Recognize when it comes, whether it's a knock at the door, whether it's on your TV screens. And by the way, we can hear some garbage on the TV coming out of these so-called teachers and preachers. If we hear it, we need to switch it off. Because what comes in here, by the way, that's what commercials are for in between all the programs. They're there to subliminally challenge you and turn your thinking from one way to the next. So that when you see a nice cream cake being advertised on the commercial, you go from one cream cake to the next because they're advertising their wares. And that's what they do with the gospel. And so we need to recognize it. We need to switch it off. If it's in the neighborhood, a neighbor talks to you, in your circle of friends, then you'll have no trouble addressing the false teaching and then dismissing it. We can't accept it. We can't say it's okay for them. No, it's not. It's not okay for them, because if they continue in it, they're not going to go to heaven. Remember, Peter opened his letter talking about the faith. Remember, I made a big point of the faith, the qualities of that faith. And then he reminded of those qualities in verse 12 of the faith. And then how important the witness and the word were. And they're the ones that cement our whole faith together. The word, the witness. Strong witness, strong word. And against that backdrop of truth, as we began this letter, that's why he wanted us to recognize the truth. He wants us to be schooled in the truth, so that when the untruth and the false came, we would say, nah, I'm not putting up with that. I'm not having it. We would recognize, you and I would recognize, after knowing what the truth was, the telltale signs to look out for. He then went on to say that no matter if they think or anyone else thinks they're getting away with it, God's judgment will come down heavily on anyone who comes into that category. And as we saw last week, if you remember, Peter used 3 examples of God's judgment. When the angels sinned against God, God judged it. They fell from grace. They were created angelic beings, amazing beings. And that's the point. It doesn't matter whether you're a prince or a pauper. God will not discriminate against sin. He will say, that is sin, and that's going to be judged. Whether you're the Queen of England or whether you're the person living on the streets down Swift Road. If you're living in sin, you're going to be judged for it. And false teachers are going to be judged because it's sinful. And so when he gave those examples of the angels, the ancient world, if you remember, the flood came because God looked down on sin and he judged it. And then the other example was the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. God looked down on sin and judged it. Noah was freed in the ancient world and his family. Lot was freed and his family because they were the ones who were walking with God. That's what we need to ask ourselves every day. Are we walking with God? Who are we walking with? Let's check who we're walking with every day. I think some days when we check who we're walking with, we might look and see something or somebody that is not really a godly person or a godly thing that we should be walking with. That's what God wants us to do. Because in the past he's judged those who are walking in sin. And so along with Peter this morning, I want to make sure that you know what a false teacher is. And so we're going to see more insight on false teachers in these verses. So let's first of all look at what a false teacher is and how to recognize them. They follow the flesh. Look at verse 10. They follow the flesh. Especially those who indulge in the lust of defiling passion and despise authority. Another version says, this is especially true of those who follow the corrupt desire of the flesh and despise authority. As we're going to see in the next point in verse 13, I'm going to make a more pointed explanation of it. There's a word called reveling or revel. And this kind of behavior is ungodly. And there's one word that gives us the reason for this behavior. And as we look at verse 10, that word is the flesh. Flesh. You and I are born in the flesh. We're born human beings in the flesh. And when we're born human beings, guess what? We're born with sin. Sin of the flesh. We're all in that category. Every one of us. That's what Romans is all about. All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. There's no exceptions. We're all in the flesh. You know, the so-called false teachers, according to this verse, are still operating in the flesh. If you remember a couple of weeks ago, I said that in my opinion, these false teachers were not saved. They were not truly born again. They never had a spiritual experience that took them from sinner to saint, from evil to good, from being born of the flesh to being born of the Spirit. To all intents and purposes, they went through the motions. Went to church, could even have gone to seminary. You know, I know those who have been to seminary who, when they talk about, you know, the reason for going there, it wasn't a calling. Oh, it was a good career. I went because it was a good career. I had people in my family say, oh, you should be a pastor, a minister, whatever. You need to go to seminary. I was an example of that in the Catholic institution because my mother wanted me to go to be a priest. If I'd have gone on and been a priest and gone through all of the teaching and all of that, it had been just a career for me. I didn't want to do it. That's why after 4 years I came out and everybody but me was disappointed. It was the worst 4 years of my life. But guess what? I recognized it wasn't for me. But look at it today. I think there are some who've not recognized that, gone through all the teaching, the seminary, all of those things, and become these false teachers. Because it's a job. It's a career. All of those things are the wrong motives for being in the ministry. But it's out there. Some, obviously, I've known some who've joined the staff in big churches. But they were not operating by the power of the Holy Spirit. They were operating in the flesh. And the flesh is the depraved nature of man that does not want to submit to God or any kind of authority. There's a battle going on. Just look at Galatians. I didn't put this up on the screen because I found it this morning as I'm going over my notes. It's in Galatians chapter 5, verses 16 and 18. And this section of Galatians is talking about walking in the Spirit. Walking in the Spirit. And Paul, as he writes to the churches in Galatia, these are churches, recognizes that there's a battle going on. This is happening in the churches. And so what he says in Galatians 5, verse 16, but I say, this is Paul, walk by the Spirit, and you will not gratify the desires of the flesh. Spirit, flesh. They're right there. And it says this, for the desire of the flesh, desires of the flesh are against the Spirit, and the desires of the Spirit are against the flesh. For these are in conflict with each other. There's a conflict going on. And just because you're born again of the Spirit doesn't mean to say that all those fleshly desires will suddenly disappear. Because we're born in sin and shaped in iniquity, that sin is attractive to us. Those things that are wrong are still attractive to us after we become born again. And in fact, when we become born again, the devil tries even harder to get you to fall into them. Because when you're not a Christian, he's already got you and you can do whatever you like. And so the battle begins to rage. And you become born again. And it's a conflict that's going on from day one till the day you die. But we have the power of the Holy Spirit to overcome anything that the devil wants to throw at us in the flesh. But it's going on. And it's a conflict, and they oppose each other to keep you from doing the things you want to do. But if you are led by the Spirit, you're not under the law. Now look at the works of the flesh. Sexual immorality, impurity, sensuality, idolatry, sorcery, enmity, strife, jealousy, fits of anger, rivalries, dissensions, divisions, envy, drunkenness, orgies, and things like these. Paul says, I warn you, as I warned you before, for those who do such things will not inherit the kingdom of God. And then it goes on to describe the fruit of the Spirit. Those things we've just talked about are the fruit of the flesh. Then he talks about the fruit of the Spirit. And they're completely opposite to one another. But we're in a battle. And so when I talk about God's authority, When I talk about God and His Word is the authority that any pastor or teacher or you and I as believers have got to live by. And how you and I are to see this Word as our controlling influence on our lives, on the decisions we make, and whether or not we are to accept any person's teaching. Whether we accept a mandate from a government legislation or whatever it might be or wherever it might come from. If it contradicts God's teaching, we must reject it. Must. Let me remind you again, it was God who established order and authority in this world for man to keep. God is the author, man is the receiver and the working out person of that order. We have to work it out. It says work out your salvation with fear and trembling. We have to figure it out. But guess what? Without God, without the Holy Spirit, man is figuring it out all wrong. They're figuring it out wrong. God says parents are to have authority over their children. Parents. They're the authority, not the government, not the school. Parents. Wow. That authority has been stripped. You cannot tell your kids off now. You can't do this. You can't do that. Who are they to say you can't do this? I think they forget they were kids once. God says parents are to have authority over children. We've seen it in Peter. Peter's gone through all of these. Employers are to have authority over employees. Husbands' authority over their wives. Pastors' authority over the flock. But let's remember, all of these authorities are under the great authority of Jesus Christ. That's the key. You can work together in harmony together under God's authority, because God's authority will allow you to work it out. We should submit to those in authority, even those who govern over us, unless they contravene the Word of God. Right now, there's a lot of contravening of the Word of God. You and I need to make a stand, which is where I believe we're right at right now with man trying to be God. Man's trying to change God's rule of authority, dictate what should happen, even if it's ungodly. They don't care. Man's sinful nature has taken over not just the world, hear this, it's taken over the church. Man's sinful nature has taken over the church. Peter recognized it in that day. We should recognize it in this day. Man's nature encourages pride. When the ego is in charge, that's where most false teachers start, with a big ego. These apostates will stop at nothing in order to promote and protect themselves. Their attitude is completely opposite to that of Jesus. What do we see of Jesus? What do we read of Jesus? He willingly emptied himself to become a servant, and then he died on a cruel cross as a sacrifice for the sins of the world. Matthew's Gospel, we looked at it on Monday night when Ben was going through Matthew 20:28. It says this, just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and give his life a ransom for many. Here's the Messiah, the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords. The Bible says he was in heaven equal with God, but did not deem it something that he could not do to lower himself and become as a servant. He came. The night before he was betrayed, he washed the disciples' feet. Wow. The master washing the servants' feet, the disciples' feet. You know, I don't see many foot washing evangelists today. I don't. It's about what you can do for them, about how you can make their life comfortable, and all the trappings of life go with their careers. It's not biblical. It really isn't biblical. This is what this word is saying, that these apostates are self-willed. It says bold and arrogant. Bold and arrogant. That's what verse 10 says, which means they lived to please themselves and would even defy God to get what they wanted. Somebody sent me a little clip of something they were reading this week, which touches on this issue of pridefulness and arrogance, as opposed to servant and humility, which is who Jesus was. Humble yourselves, therefore, under God's mighty hand, that he may lift you up in due time. And again, we read that in 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 6. It says then, in the Gospels, Jesus compares the kingdom of God to a field where a farmer sowed good seed. But while he slept, an enemy came and sowed bad seed. Side by side, wheat and tares grew up together. One was the real deal, the other was just pretending to be. A man asked me once, do you know how farmers tell the difference between wheat and tares, since from a difference they look so much alike? No, he said, please tell me. He barely let me finish, he was so excited. When the wind blows, the wheat bows down. Wow, I was speechless. The tares are apparently rigid and unbending. Kind of reminds you of a religious Pharisee. When God breathes on us and we know he is speaking to us, we are to be flexible in his hands, not rigid and stiff. We are to bow like the wheat and like Jesus. Jesus didn't just act humble, he was humble. That's who we should be. That's who teachers should be. That's who leadership should be. And evangelists and pastors and those who are given the responsibility to lead God's sheep, to lead them into green pastures. And that's what Peter wants us to recognize. There's a Proverb 21:24 that describes the person that Peter is talking about here perfectly. Proverbs 21:24 says, the proud and arrogant person, mocker is his name, behaves with insolent fury. You know, they outwardly appear to serve God. They outwardly appear to minister to people, but inwardly they feed their own egos and feather their own nests. False teachers follow the flesh. Secondly, this morning, false teachers who follow the flesh also revel with great pleasure. Verse 13 and 14 says this: suffering wrong as the wage for their wrongdoing, they count it pleasure to revel in the daytime. They are blots and blemishes, reveling in their deceptions, while they feast with you. They have eyes full of adultery, insatiable for sin. They entice unsteady souls. They have hearts trained in greed, accursed children. Wow. You just stop and think about some of these words that Peter's saying. Peter's writing these down because he's recognized what they look like. they describe how they love to carouse. The King James Version uses the words riot and sporting, which refers to extreme indulgence in sensual pleasures. And we've talked about some of these things in previous weeks. So Peter wants to make sure you and I would recognize, by the way someone behaves, the signs of what this false teacher looks like. The NIV, it says this: their idea of pleasure is to carouse in broad daylight. They don't even hide it anymore. Reveling in their pleasures while they feast with you. They're amongst us. That's what he's saying. They're in the midst of us. You might be sat next to one at a dinner table with eyes full of adultery. They never stop sinning. I mean, the times I hear that happening to preachers who've been caught in adultery, I cringe. It hurts so much. And what a bad witness. And then that creeps into the church. You know, God's word is so clear. It's so precise for us. These things hurt us. They can be in the church, and I know from experience in the past, they can be in our families. And it hurts. God says, be strong. Be strong. You're doing the right thing to stand with the word of God. Just be strong. It says, with eyes full of adultery, they never stop sinning. They seduce the unstable. In other words, the vulnerable. They are experts in greed. Oh my goodness. Wow. Peter called them out 2,500 years ago, before they had these 3 or 4 jets and all the property that they had and all the millions in the bank. Peter recognized it ahead of time. It's almost like what Peter's saying then, which is certainly true now, they're like professional evangelists, professional teachers or pastors. They've fallen into the same trap as those who are professionals in the world, who behave in this manner and use their position and power to take advantage of the vulnerable and weak. As it says, they seduce the unstable. Well, as we look at the last 2 verses this morning, like I said last week, it might seem that these false teachers might be getting away with it, but they won't. God will judge them for what they do in this life. But here's what's so sad. They are the ones who have made the choice to behave in such a manner. Look at verse 15. Forsaking the right way, they have gone astray. They have followed the way of Balaam, the son of Beor, who loved gain from wrongdoing. Forsaking the right way, they've gone astray. What a sad verse. That's such a sad, sad verse. Because what's being implied here, they were once on the right path, but they chose the way of doing wrong. They made a choice. They were the ones who said, I'm now going against God and his teaching. You see, in life, everyone has a choice. That choice can be so rewarding, or it can be so costly. And as we said earlier, Peter gave 3 examples of God's judgment. Now he gives another example as he talks about Balaam, who loved the wages of wickedness, being rebuked for his wickedness. And as we said, God used a donkey. False teachers are out there. We need to recognize them. We need to stop supporting them. We need to call them out in their false teaching. And like I said right at the beginning, if God can use a donkey to call out wickedness, he can use you and me. Let's call it out. Let's call it what it is. I don't know if you know who Balaam was, but Balaam was an Old Testament prophet. But he was a false Old Testament prophet. My commentary, one of them I used, says this about who he was. He was an example of a false prophet, an Old Testament prophet who compromised himself for sale to whoever paid him the highest price, who preferred wealth and popularity over faithfulness and obedience to God. And again, I think that describes false prophets today. Through a talking donkey, God kept him from cursing Israel. He was about to come against Israel with his prophecies, but God used a donkey to stop him. And I believe God will use whatever means possible to stop these false prophets from doing the damage they're doing. And the only way they can be stopped is to be called out for what they're doing. Guys, in these last days, there's going to be an abundance of false teachers. They're going to be pleading for your support. You know, there's a need for spiritual discernment and a growing knowledge of the Word of God like never before. It says in verse 14, as cursed children. These false teachers are marked men and women. They're not going to escape. They will be banished from the presence of the Lord forever. In the meantime, get in Bible study. Sign up for Bible study. Grow in the Word of God, so that when deception presents itself and comes knocking on your door, you'll recognize it. Let's all in these days be able to recognize that which is false and walk in that which is genuine, which is God's truth from his Word. Let's pray.